Brodie, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Lupe, it's my pleasure. I'm always excited to have a reason to talk to you.
I like to start every interview by asking guests, as a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up?
There's so many different answers to this question. I mean, when I was really little, I wanted to be Wonder Woman. And then I went through this really nerdy phase when I was 12 or 13 where I thought I wanted to be an investment banker. I don't think I really even knew what it was.
And I've always, cool.
Yeah, it sounded cool. I think I carried a briefcase to 8th grade. And then a lifelong career dream that I've had. Well, actually, I also had a practical hope when I was a kid that I'd be a psychologist, and now I'm an industrial psychologist. So I kind of did that one. And then I've always wanted to be a landscaper, not a landscape architect or designer out there digging holes, doing manual labor. That's honestly my dream job.
Really? Yeah. Where do you think that came from?
I really like the work that I do, but I'm not meant to sit at a desk all day. It's not a good fit for me. I'd be much happier out in nature, outside. I get great satisfaction from doing manual labor and where you can see the fruits of your labor at the end of the day. Plus, you leave at the end of the day and your work is done. You don't have to take it home with you. Using your body. It's beautiful. It's creative.
Oh.
How about you, Lupe?
A lot of things, but the first one I can remember is being a doctor. And I think because I wanted to help people. And I remember telling family and they would all say, ooh, she wants to be a doctor. So it was like this.
Oh, no pressure.
It was this nice feeling of like, oh, she wants to be the doctor. And I think it was the helping people piece. And now that I think about being a doctor, I don't think I would be, maybe the people aspect, but I don't do well with blood or, you know.
It's good reason. Yeah. But now you are helping people. You're doing the part
people.
That you wanted to do, just in a different form.
Yes. Well, tell me, how do you think that the Wonder Woman, the investment banker, the landscaper connect to what you do today?
You ask good and tough questions, Lupe. Let's see. Wonder Woman, when I was a kid and still as an adult, I always liked Wonder Woman because she is kind of this badass woman, but also graceful, very high integrity. I think I probably strive to be those things. I'm not sure how well I do them, but it's a North Star. The investment banker, I really like math and I like numbers and I like working in business. It's funny, I realize so many of my coaching clients are from finance or banking or private equity. And so there's just something about that world I think that I enjoy. Maybe it's the analytical side. And then being a landscaper, that's actually a big part of me that's completely neglected. I am not outside in nature doing manual labor, being creative. I don't use those parts of me at all. It's something I'm working on. I tried. I'm looking outside right now at my terrace and I planted all of these elephant ears and banana plants and all this stuff, but it got too hot and nothing grew. So I have some work I need to do if I'm really going to be a landscaper. I had about a 60% success rate this summer.
Next year it'll be 65 or 70.
Yeah, incremental progress. Let's hope so.
Well, do you mind sharing for our audience what you do today?
I'd be delighted to. So despite not doing any of those things I wanted to do when I was a kid, I love what I do today. So I'm an industrial psychologist, which is business psychology, for lack of a better way to put it. I'm an executive coach. I'm also a part-time professor at Georgetown University. I love to talk about the topic of feedback. Thank you. I studied feedback and coaching a lot when I was in graduate school. They sort of became my niche. I've written a few books on the topic, and so I like to write and speak and do that kind of stuff. So it's a real hodgepodge of things, but they all kind of circle around helping people maximize their potential and be self-aware and set goals and achieve their goals, mostly in the context of work.
I love it. And I've read one of your books. I think it's the most recent book on feedback.
Yes, I have one coming out in 3 weeks, though.
Oh my gosh.
I know.
Oh, so we can talk about both of them. We can talk about both. Yes. So the reason I really want to share your story, and two, because I found your book so helpful. And when I think about my clients, my coaching clients, I've recommended it to them and several clients.
Thank you.
I just think it's so helpful and it could be served so many people in so many ways. So I'd love to dig into this topic of feedback because it's a topic that I think a lot of people are scared of.
I totally agree.
Professionally and personally.
Yeah, it's the other F word.
Yes, it is.
Yeah,
people may be more afraid of that second F word than the first.
I think you're right. And in a lot of workshops and talks that I've done, and actually I did some of this research for my book, I'll ask people, what's your immediate emotional reaction when someone says to you, I want to give you some feedback? And 75% of the time, it's super negative. It elicits such a strong response of fear, anxiety, dread, assuming it's going to be bad. It's just amazing to me. And so much of that comes from people's bad past experiences with feedback. It starts when we're young. It's your parents, your teachers, your coaches, your bosses, your friends. The reality is most people are highly unskilled when it comes to giving feedback. And so it shapes all of us to have this negative connotation about feedback.
Yes, I completely agree. And my first reaction, that's something that I've been actively working on, partly because of your book and just in general, because I want to get feedback and I want to get better in general as a person, as a coach, and was that there was this negative connotation. I love a section in your book where you, at the beginning, you talk about your day. One, I was impressed with everything that you do in a day. I was like, and second, just the way you identified feedback that we wouldn't necessarily at first glance think about as feedback if we're not studying feedback. So do you mind kind of talking through that? Because so to give people an idea of the different forms feedback comes.
I would love
a person's day. Yeah.
And I'm really glad that that stuck out to you because I had two goals when I wrote that book. One was to shift the way that people think about feedback. Because I think usually when people think about feedback, they think about big deal feedback, an uncomfortable conversation, a performance review, something like that. But the reality is most feedback that we receive is not a big deal. It's very small. And that was what I was trying to convey with that list. I'll come back to that in just a second. Yeah. My other goal with this book was from my time in my PhD program and doing research, I realized we actually know so much about what makes feedback more effective, these little nuances. And so rarely does that actually get into practice, into organizations and into people's lives. So one of my goals with the book, my other goal with the book was to take this academic research from psychology, from business, from education, and make it approachable and applicable to people. I sometimes use the metaphor of feeding a baby bird. The mother bird chews up a worm and then spits it back out to the baby. I know that's a horrible metaphor, but that's how I think about it sometimes. Okay, so back to your question about the list. So one of the things I did in the book was I tried to document every instance of giving, receiving, asking for, or using feedback in a typical day. I think there were like 25 moments.
There were a lot, yeah.
And some of them are really mundane, like walking out of the house and I noticed that it's cold and I didn't wear an appropriate jacket. That is feedback. We rarely think about that as feedback, but you are getting data on yourself and the decisions that you have made. And it's telling you chose the wrong outerwear for that day. Something like giving a colleague some comments on a Word document that they're working on. That's an example of feedback. And it's probably very specific, very tactical, and not a big deal. And it's going to help them produce a better product, which is ultimately the goal of feedback. We want to help people become more self-aware and do things even better to grow and have higher performance. If we didn't get feedback, we would live our lives in a vacuum, completely unaware of whether or not we're doing the right things, the impact that we're having on others. Feedback really holds up a mirror and it gives us data on ourselves. That's one of my biggest goals, is to help people reposition the way they think about feedback and see it as useful data on them, not something that's happening to them that they're a victim of, that others are imposing on them.
I love that, Brodie. And that's what I love too about the book, that you shared it's a two-way street. It's not just something happening to us. So you said the first goal with your book was to shift the way people think about feedback. So I imagine part of that is changing our mindset around that feedback is useful. How else could people think about feedback that allows them to change their mindset around it?
I think you hit the nail on the head with the first one, that feedback is useful. Ultimately, feedback should help you either become more self-aware, get closer to your goals, have higher performance, learn and grow in some way. If people give you feedback that's not useful, you don't have to take it. Just because someone gives you feedback doesn't mean you have to do something with it. And also you have to question, what are people's intentions? By giving you that feedback, did they really want to help you? Or were they trying to do something to make themselves feel better? Which, a side note, if you're ever giving someone feedback and your intention is anything but trying to help someone, you probably shouldn't give that feedback. So I want people to see feedback as useful. I want them to see it as not a big deal. If you added up all of your feedback moments for an entire year, I'd be willing to bet that 5% of them are big deal feedback. Most of it is very, very insignificant and helps us iterate and immediately make changes in our lives and in our work. I also want people to see feedback as a way to hold up the mirror and understand themselves more, how they're showing up in the world, how they are impacting and influencing other people, and whether or not that's what they want. Are their intentions aligning with what other people are experiencing? And if not, what do they need to tweak to make those more aligned? Feedback also tells you exactly what you need to do to get closer to your goals. This is one of the reasons I love feedback so much. It is the data that tell you the distance between where you are and where you want to be on pretty much anything. So this is such a basic example, but let's say you're trying to lose weight. You want to weigh 150 pounds. You step on the scale and you weigh 156 pounds. That is feedback. You are 6 pounds away from your goal. Now you have to figure out what you want to do about it, but it's at least helping you gauge where you stand. And if you're making efforts, how those are working for you. Let's say you want to get promoted at work and you don't get the promotion someone else does, but you get some feedback on why you weren't selected. Well, that's basically going to tell you what it is that you need to do to be more competitive next time. Sometimes you have to take the high road in order to hear and receive feedback that way. But especially if you can get past any initial emotions that you're having that might make you feel hijacked or defensive, let those subside and then try to think about the feedback in an objective way.
And I love that you shared the metaphor of a mirror. I like to think of coaching as a mirror for people. And so I love that you're sharing that feedback is a mirror for us to see the impact we're having and maybe it's not lining up.
And feedback is a really powerful tool in coaching. Often we think about feedback in coaching from a very formal perspective. You are doing a 360, you're talking about assessment feedback. But coaches are actually a great source of feedback to their clients. Think about the skill that we use at the Boda Group, noticing and naming. That is a form of feedback. Lupe, I noticed that when you smile, your face lights up. Well, there's some feedback for you. But all I'm doing is noticing and naming what I'm seeing.
And if I haven't mentioned this before this, Brodie and I are part of the Boda Group. I've mentioned that I joined an executive coaching firm and Brodie is one of my colleagues and someone I deeply admire. So we get to work together. And I'm glad you're sharing all of this. Is so generous because I know it's going to help people change their mindset around it. So the second goal you mentioned was what makes feedback more effective. So I'd love to hear what your thoughts are around what makes it more effective. I can think of a couple of things that stood out to me as I was reading your book that I thought, yes, this is going to help so many people.
Well, I could talk for literally hours about all the things that make feedback more effective, but I'll distill it down to some of my favorites and some things that I discovered when either doing research or reading other people's original research and just feeling so surprised, like, gosh, why don't other people know this? This is so valuable. I think one that's really important is making sure that feedback always focuses on behaviors, never on a person or their character or their abilities. The whole reason we give feedback is to help people do something different or something better in the future. And so that's really all about your behaviors. What exactly is it that you're doing or not doing? So when we give feedback that focuses on behavior, that's a lot easier to take and do something with it when you're on the receiving end. On the contrary, when you give people feedback on who they are as a person, such as their character, their abilities, their personality, it's really hard to change those things. And that's when people are much more likely to get defensive and reject the feedback. And a really simple way to notice the difference is to make sure your feedback sounds like you do X or you did X, not you are X. Carol Dweck is an amazing professor, writer, psychologist at Stanford University, and she wrote a great book called Mindset. And she has found in her research that this pertains not only to negative feedback, but also to positive feedback. Let's say you have a 7-year-old child, and your 7-year-old child comes home from school and they got an A on their test. Well, if you praise that child for their abilities, little Susie, great job, you got an A, you're so smart. Next time, if she takes a test and doesn't do so well, she will attribute that failure to her abilities. Whereas if you praise her for her hard work, you studied so hard for that test, great job. She's going to attribute her success to her hard work and her behavior. And then if she has a failure in the future, she will attribute that to her lack of hard work or preparation. So basically, when we praise people for their efforts and their behavior rather than their abilities or who they are, it actually makes them more resilient to failure in the future.
Oh, I love that you shared that. I love that book. And I think it can seem subtle, but it's really a big difference in how we're giving that feedback.
Especially if you think of all those moments across the years. If you're consistently praised for your abilities or your personality, you're not actually learning anything about what it is that you're doing that's good. So I find that a lot of people get this with negative feedback. They say like, okay, well, I'll make sure my negative feedback is focused on behaviors. I don't want the other person to get defensive. I want them to know what they need to do differently. I think the bigger challenge for people is to make sure their positive feedback is also focusing on behaviors. It's so easy for people to be super general and just say things like, you're awesome, you're brilliant, you're amazing. That's called the empty calories of feedback. You don't learn anything from that. It's really important for people to know what it is they're doing that you appreciate or that's having a positive impact so that they can have greater self-awareness about that and also do more of it in the future.
Yeah. And I've noticed too, as a coach, when I first started coaching, I was trying to champion people and say, you're great. And I realized it wasn't landing as deeply as when I celebrated something they were doing or something they'd done. And then that's when it landed more deeply for clients. So that was a shift that I learned too early on with my clients. Yeah, you're great. It doesn't really land as well. I mean, it might feel good for a little bit, but there's something deeper when we actually can talk about something specific.
Yeah, you got it. 100%. I'm so glad that you noticed that and made that distinction, and your clients are reaping the benefits of it now.
Well, I'd love to know what else you found makes feedback more effective.
So it's actually a study that I was involved in grad school, and it sort of makes the distinction between different types of feedback. There is process feedback and there's outcome feedback.
I love this part, by the way. Yes, I was like, yes, this makes so much sense. I think in my career, I always got the annual review feedback. And the one that's really important is the other, which you're about to, I'm sorry, I interrupted. I was like,
no, I love it. I'm glad that you like this. Okay, so you tell me, what did you feel like when you would get that annual review feedback?
So in my career, before transitioning to coaching, I had one bad feedback. That was a below expectations feedback because I worked on many jobs at the firm. I got one below expectation and I did not receive any feedback that I was not performing at the level that they wanted, that the team wanted, until I received the feedback at the end when it was too late. And I was devastated. I had just a couple of years. I was 2 years out of college. I was devastated and I didn't expect it. I thought I was doing fine. So I could have avoided that situation if I known how to maybe ask for that process feedback. And I have a sense that to people listening, it's going to resonate.
You also just highlighted a few other really important things that I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to talk about outcome versus process feedback. Tied to that is giving feedback as soon as possible after something happens. And then I'm going to also talk about the power of asking for feedback proactively. Okay, so this is a great example of outcome versus process, Lupe. So outcome feedback is when you get feedback basically at the end of something. So it's that annual performance review. It's your final grade on a report card. It's something that you receive when basically it's too late to make any changes. Process feedback is all the feedback that you receive along the way. So during that year, if the team had given you some feedback on what wasn't working so well, you could have actually done something with it and course corrected, and then your evaluation might have sounded a little bit different. Or from an academic perspective, it's the grades and the feedback that you're getting on your performance along the way so that your final grade isn't a surprise and you feel like you've been able to do your best to achieve the grade that you want. Not surprisingly, people are so much more open to process feedback, especially when it comes to negative feedback. Negative process feedback tells people what they need to do to get better. And they really appreciate that. And that then results in a greater likelihood of getting positive outcome feedback. So if you kind of cross outcome and process feedback with positive and negative, people love negative process feedback because it helps them understand how they're doing and what they need to do to get better. Interestingly, if you just give them tons of positive process feedback, after a while, they kind of tune it out because they're like, yeah, I'm fine. I get it. Where the negative process feedback is helping them with continuous improvement. And people love positive outcome feedback. They like to know that in the end, they have done a good job. People are not very enthusiastic about getting negative outcome feedback. Now, one thing that you can do to sort of reframe some of those feedback experiences is to expand your time horizon. So if you take like an annual performance review, You could say, oh, my performance review that I'm getting in December at the end of the year, that's it. That is the outcome feedback. Well, if you can say, no, I've been at this organization for 10 years and I'll probably be here for 10 more years. This is just another milestone along the way. That really takes a growth mindset to be able to frame it in that way. But expanding your time horizon can help change some of that outcome feedback to process feedback. But when you're the person who's giving the feedback, the more that you can give it all along the way, the more effective it's going to be for the other person. And that gets to this principle of time. Usually, the best time to give feedback is as soon as possible after something happens. It's for a few reasons. It shows that you care. I can only imagine what you thought about your team when you had that performance review and were hearing something for the first time. You probably thought, why didn't anybody tell me until now? That's a terrible feeling. So giving feedback soon shows that you care. It also ensures that there's less likelihood of disagreement because it'll be fresh in your mind, it'll be fresh in the other person's mind, and you won't have forgotten specifics of what happened. And the other most important reason is because it allows people to do something with it immediately. Again, if the whole idea of giving feedback is to help people get better, they can start to incorporate it into their work right away when you share it. The only reasons to wait are if the situation is really emotionally charged and either you or the other person needs to cool off a little bit. And also to wait until you can be in private because surprise, surprise, no one likes getting feedback in public. Even positive feedback. A lot of people are really uncomfortable being praised in front of other people. So waiting until you can be in private is usually always a good idea.
Well, that makes me think of, I would love to hear your thoughts on, if we continue to use my example, at the firm, we worked on different jobs for a short amount of time. So this particular job was 2 months and it was the end of the 2-month review. And then I was moving on to the next team and the next company role or audit, working long hours, 2 months, busy, busy, busy. And so I get the sense that if we were to go back in time and ask them, well, why didn't you get that feedback? We were just so busy. We didn't have time. And I think that's a lot of the people who maybe struggle with feedback. That might be the mindset they're under. I just don't have time to do this. We're busy. We're under a deadline. What would you say to those people that kind of have that mindset?
Well, I also think that's exacerbated by how uncomfortable most people are giving feedback. Yes. So if you're already working really long days and you're cranking, why would you choose to have an uncomfortable conversation that's going to take time?
Yes, you're already miserable.
Yeah, I think this is a place where reframing can be really helpful. Of saying, okay, it might take 20 minutes for Lupe and me to sit down and have this conversation, but it will probably save time in the long run because she will start doing this thing differently. And I won't have to rework some of her stuff or have an even more difficult conversation later. So thinking of doing it now will actually make it more efficient and effective in the long run. Another thing is, if you're in a team environment, making sure you're setting up those opportunities to share feedback with one another so that it doesn't just get lost in the mix and the busyness of the day. So really setting aside time to share feedback in all directions. And Lupe, in your situation, you don't have to wait for other people, right? That's another place where feedback can feel powerless if you feel like you have to wait for people to give it to you. Here's another one of my favorite studies from the last few years. There's a researcher at NYU named Tessa West, and she and some neuroscientists and psychologists from the Neuro Leadership Institute did a study where they took a feedback giver and a feedback provider. They hooked them both up to a heart monitor. And in the first trial of the study, the feedback giver had to give unsolicited feedback to the other person. They were both hooked up to a heart monitor. What do you think happened, Lupe?
The heart rate for the feedback giver probably shot up.
Yes, exactly. So we all know that anticipating receiving feedback is a really anxiety-provoking experience. Like I said earlier, if someone says, I want to give you some feedback, most people have a high stress response. So it's not surprising that the person who received that unsolicited feedback had a major increase in their heart rate. But the person who was giving that feedback also had a really high increase in their heart rate. It's just as stressful and uncomfortable for them as it is for the person who's on the receiving end. And the reason is they're worried about how the other person's going to react. Is this going to become a really uncomfortable interaction? Are they going to get defensive? Are they going to get mad at me? Are they going to question my judgment? Do I even know what I'm talking about? So it's no wonder people avoid giving feedback. All of those feelings come to the surface for people. Now, in the second trial of this study, the feedback giver was only allowed to give feedback when asked for it. So the feedback receiver was in the driver's seat. They could decide when they wanted to ask for feedback. They could decide what they wanted to ask for feedback on. Neither person had that stress response.
Ooh, interesting.
So when you proactively ask someone for feedback, it's not stressful for you because you're choosing who you want to ask, when you want to ask them. And if you ask good, specific questions, you're controlling what you're asking for feedback on. And then if you're the person who's being asked, you're not worried about how the other person's going to respond because they've basically opened the door and invited you to share. So asking for feedback is actually one of the best ways to get the feedback that you want and also make it easier for the other person to share that feedback with you.
Oh, I love that. And I love that that study showed that, because when I look back at that experience from my side, I should have asked for the feedback. I should have asked for, how am I doing? What could I do better?
Yeah.
And in coaching conversations now, I hear both sides of it, where someone's really struggling to give the feedback because of all the things you just said. And then there are people who are wondering how they're doing and they don't think to ask for it. It's not a thing that comes across to them, or it just seems like, I'll just wait. A lot of people think, I'll just wait. And so I love that you just shared that. It relieves the stress for both sides.
And the more specific your question is, the higher quality feedback you're going to receive in return. And the easier it will be for the other person to respond. So instead of me saying, hey, Lupe, can you give me some feedback? I might say, Lupe, I really enjoyed recording this podcast with you. I'd love for you to share something you thought I did that was really effective and something that you think I could work on for next time. Or I could even tell you specific things that I want feedback on. I might say, Lupe, I loved being on this podcast with you. I have a tendency to talk too much. I'm trying to work on being more concise. Anything you think I could work on for next time?
Yeah. So that invites the listener to think about specifically what you're asking for, which, by the way, I think you're perfect and not overly, you're perfectly concise.
Thank you. I've been working on it for a long time.
So this being specific when asking for it. So we've been talking about how to be more effective at the feedback. What are some of the other things that make feedback effective?
Another one of my favorite little levers that you can pull when you're giving feedback to other people is making sure that you are focusing on evidence and being as specific as possible. A lot of people get themselves into trouble when they give feedback because they're actually making assumptions about what's going on in someone's head or why someone's doing something. And as much as you might think you know, you probably don't know. And so when you give feedback to someone, make sure you focus on observable behaviors and facts.
In your book, you gave an example, I think, of a speaker who is speaking, someone talking, public speaking, and getting feedback on the speaking. And then you're a bad speaker would be a very generalized feedback versus you kept looking down at your notes and you weren't connecting, and something like that, I think was the example.
Okay, so let's riff on that one a little bit. Great job. And I do think I talked about that in the book, but I'm glad you brought this one up. So an example of very fact-based feedback would be to say, you spoke very quickly. I could even push myself to be more specific and say how quickly they were speaking, but that was something I experienced. Going a step further and making assumptions or inferences about why is likely to make that person defensive or to discount the feedback. So if I said, Lupe, you spoke really fast because you were nervous. Well, I'm going to over-index on that last part. No, I wasn't nervous. And so therefore, I totally missed what you said about talking too fast. And people do this all the time. We make inferences and assumptions about why people are doing things. And then we lump that in with our feedback when it really might not be true. And so we want to focus on the thing that we saw or experienced and only share that and let the other person figure out why it was that they did that thing. That's theirs to own, not ours.
I love that. Maybe switching gears a little bit. I'd love to know if you've always been good at feedback. Or is this something that you naturally gravitated to because you were good at it?
No.
Is this something you were scared of? What's your story around feedback? Because I can hear your passion. I think listeners can hear your passion, your energy around it. The way you talk about it doesn't feel as intimidating. So I'd love to hear how you kind of came to that point.
It is such a nerdy thing to be enthusiastic about. And I own that fully. I can admit that I'm a big nerd. So the funny thing is, when I was in my first year of graduate school, I went and I sat down in my PhD advisor's office to talk about what I was going to focus my research on. And I was all over the place because industrial psychology is a huge field. It basically touches anything that has to do with people in the workplace. And so I was like, oh, well, I'm interested in gender stuff, and I'm interested in the physiological effects of stress, like measuring cortisol, and I'm interested in work-life balance and like all over the place. And my PhD advisor is like, well, I study performance management and feedback. And I was like, oh my God, why would you want to dedicate your entire career to studying something as dry and nichey as feedback? But as you can see, it did not take long for me to become a convert. And I think what really hooked me about feedback is the fact that it gives us data on ourselves. And anything that we are working on that we want to know the impact that we're having, how we're doing, if we want to get better, if we want to sort of orient ourselves in time and space in the world around us, we have to have feedback. And so just as I started learning about all the different ways that feedback shows up in our lives and all of these little tweaks that you can make in how you handle feedback, I don't know, I just found it to be really sticky. And I think part of that is also how bad people are at it and how uncomfortable they are and how infrequently these things that we know from research actually get out into practice. And so I think I have a lot of enthusiasm about like wanting to preach. I want people to know it doesn't have to be bad. It can actually be a really great tool. And if you're a manager or a leader in an organization, you can change the way you're giving feedback so it's not uncomfortable. And so it actually helps people grow and perform better. I guess I do get excited to talk about it because I kind of want people to see that it doesn't have to be a scary thing.
You see the power it can have, the positive impact it can have when done more effectively.
Yeah. Another point I was trying to get across in that list in the book where I documented all my instances of feedback was to help people think about, wow, what would my life be like if I got no feedback? It would be kind of boring and you would probably feel kind of lost and very unsure, very uncertain all the time. People might actually have more anxiety if they didn't get any feedback than the anxiety they experience from uncomfortable feedback conversations.
Because then people know where they stand versus making up stories in our minds on what might be happening. First, I love your enthusiasm for it because it's contagious.
Thank you, Lupe.
I'm like, yes. And I know you mentioned that when we ask for feedback, it's less stressful when we do it in specific ways, when we're doing it with people we probably trust. And I imagine there's people probably out there thinking, yeah, but I think I would still feel uncomfortable. And it's something I actively work on, even with my husband, getting feedback on personal things, right? The more we do it, the more we ask for that other type of feedback, that it gets easier. Like kind of this growth mindset where it becomes easier to do the more we do it.
There's this variable that we often talk about in research called feedback orientation. And it's basically your attitude about feedback. I like to think about it as your feedback muscles. How strong or atrophied are your feedback muscles? And it's something that you can really intentionally build up. Just like you said, the more you do it, and in every direction, right? Giving it, asking for it, receiving it, using it, thinking about it, deciding about feedback that you don't want to accept or don't want to do anything with is also just as important. But the more that you do that and recognize that, the stronger those feedback muscles get and the less daunting it seems. But I also want to normalize that sometimes it can be really uncomfortable because receiving critical feedback can feel threatening and it can make us have a lot of self-doubt. Giving tough feedback to someone we care about, we don't want to hurt their feelings. And so that can feel uncomfortable. It's totally normal to feel uncomfortable when we have to give or receive challenging feedback. I still struggle with it every single time. I have to pump myself up, get brave.
Okay, that makes me feel better.
Oh yeah. I have to really think about exactly what I want to say and then just say it and stop, because I tend to be one of these people who digs myself into a hole. I'll keep talking and the message gets lost and actually make it worse. And so even though I've been studying and talking about feedback for almost 20 years now, it's still something that I struggle with in work and also in my personal life. And so it's totally normal if people feel uncomfortable. But I can tell you that the uncomfortable situations are a very, very, very small minority of all of my feedback exchanges at any given time.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'd love to learn more about the new book.
So the new book is on coaching skills. I've been teaching a class for about 5 years at Georgetown University with my friend and collaborator, Shauna Waters. Shauna is an executive at BetterUp, not virtual, but tech-enabled coaching organization. And Shauna and I, we love teaching this class. We have a great time co-teaching it. It's in the HR Master's program, and the goal is to teach coaching skills. So not to make our students coaches, but to help them develop this skill set around asking great questions and really listening, thinking about mindsets, doing the self-work to think about how they're showing up in the conversation. We could never find exactly the book that we wanted for our class. We have a few different books and we cobbled together lots of articles. But then one day we were like, we should just write the book. And it was around the same time that my feedback book came out. And so I said to my publisher, hey, we want to write this book. And now 2 years later, we have written the book. And I think it comes out November 1st.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, with my feedback book, they just kind of like showed up on my doorstep one day. So probably November 1st. But the goal is to help anyone who's interested in developing a coaching skill set walk away with some really practical tools and techniques. And we sort of take like a levels of analysis approach. So the book, the first few chapters are about you. And so we talk a lot about psychology and mindset and understanding your own thoughts and patterns. And then we move on to you and one other person. So in a dyadic relationship, how are you listening? How are you communicating? How are you showing up with other people, responding to them? Then we move on to using those coaching skills in group settings with groups or teams. And then the biggest circle, it's kind of like throwing a rock into a pond, is like using your coaching skills out in the world. It's maybe a little bit idealistic, but if you just take like politics in America, conversations usually devolve into places we don't want to go. But if you can bring more of a coaching mindset, seek to understand people, try to connect with people, how could that actually elevate the dialogue? So again, that
I love that. I can't wait to read it.
Thank you. We had a really good time working on it. Right now we're trying to figure out like, okay, what are we going to do? Are we going to make some programming with it? I don't know, but we know we're going to use it for our class. That's the one thing we know. Our students will read it.
And so what's the name of the book? So in case anyone wants to pre-order.
It's called The Coaching Shift.
Awesome.
And Lupe, you can use your feedback skills from the feedback book to give me feedback on the coaching book if you read it.
Okay, I will read it. I will definitely read it. I'm all about learning how to become better at coaching and how I can serve others. And so
I think it'll be pretty rudimentary for you.
It's always something to learn. Yes.
Well, people who work with you as a coach are very, very lucky.
Oh, thank you, Brodie. Well, thank you so much for being here today and for sharing so generously. Where can people find your book?
Okay, so the name of the feedback book is Feedback Fundamentals and Evidence-Based Practices. Give it, ask for it, use it. And you can find it most places. Amazon. I definitely encourage people to go to local bookstores too, support small businesses. So here in DC, I shop at Politics and Prose. It's a great bookstore. I think it's on bookshop.org if you want to support nonprofit bookstores, and probably a few other websites where you like to buy books.
And I highly recommend it for anyone who is in a place where they want to give feedback more effectively or receive feedback, really for anyone, because we all have feedback. Like you said, it's a part of our day, all day, every day. And so we can all become better at it.
Absolutely. I'm a woman on a mission. Maybe this is where the Wonder Woman comes back in.
Yes, that's a thought I had as you said Wonder Woman. You're doing this through the work you're doing today.
Maybe I'll be Wonder Woman for Halloween, but instead of a W, I'll put a big F on my belt for feedback.
I love it. Yes.
If I do it, I'll send you a picture with it.
Yes. You can put it as part of your marketing for the book.
Here you go.
Well, thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always such a blast talking to you. I love listening to other episodes of your podcast, so I'm really honored that you invited me to join. Thank you.
Thank you.